Hello, Viking.TV viewers. I'm coming to you today from Montreal, Canada. My name is Knut Nesse, and I'm going to be your Viking resident historian for this lecture on Canadian exploration. As you saw in the bio, perhaps I'm really Norwegian, but I've made Canada my home. So today I'm here at home in Montreal, where Mother Nature has thrown us a curveball by giving us a couple of inches of snow this morning. We had 2 weeks of no snow here, and today, this morning, there was white snow on the ground. But don't worry, when the Viking Octantis comes up to pass by Montreal, I'm sure it's going to be nice and warm and spring-like again. Yes, and that's the reason why we're talking about Canada this week on Viking.TV. It's the expedition ship Viking Octantis that is now coming to do the Great Lakes expeditions and cruises. So it makes sense to talk about Canada, and today I'm going to talk about Canadian exploration. Now, the way this works is that I'll give you a 45-minute lecture, and if you have any questions along the way, you can use the question tab on the side of your Viking.TV screen, and then we'll address those questions after the lecture and try to answer as many as we can. So good, let's get started. Canadian exploration. I'm showing you a map here of Canada. It's from 1610, this map, made by Henry Hudson, who was an explorer that we will talk about a bit later. But it just shows you what little information they had about North America at the time when he tried to find the Northwest Passage, traveling up to Canada. And you see he's drawn this map here, where on the top you see Greenland. At the very bottom, you see the tip of Newfoundland, and then you see Labrador, and then there is a long bay or sound going into the left, and that was later called the Hudson Strait, and it leads you into Hudson Bay. Now, of course, the explorer Henry Hudson was very important to discovery and exploration of Canada, and he has also left his name on very many places around. Not least Hudson River down by New York, but also the big Hudson Bay and the Hudson Strait here in Canada. And even the Hudson Bay Company, which exists to this day, a very big department store here that you will see if you go and visit. So let's get started with the overview here. We're going to talk a bit about the time before Canada. What was it like? The first original population, the original settlers, the Indians and the Inuits. Then we'll talk about the quest for Canada in the second section, and go on to talk about a couple of the explorers and describe them in a little bit more detail before we finalize the talk with the legacy of Canadian exploration in the formation and establishment of Canada as a country. So it was all about getting from, you know, A to B with the use of a vessel, a ship. That was really what held back exploration in the old times. It was very difficult to cross big oceans and big waterways, and we see from petroglyphs like you see here on this slide that people were always very interested in having vessels to get them over big waters and oceans. And the earliest, you know, vessel that we know about is this pest canoe that you see here in the top right corner, really just a dug out trunk of a tree, but it's the only one that has been preserved, and it's all of 8,000 or more years old, found in the Netherlands. So it was all about the ship, and believe it or not, the big innovation that made it possible to build bigger ships was the plank, the simple thing like the plank. This was what the Egyptians were able to innovate shipbuilding by using planks they tied together and made watertight by various ways. And this evolved into ships that were used in the Mediterranean, and also evolved as ships used by other European civilizations like the Vikings. You see a Viking ship here up in the top left corner. The Vikings were very innovative in their shipbuilding. They had a very special style called the clinker build style, which means that they would lay the planks on top of each other, and then they would put in a frame afterwards, making the ship very, very flexible. And this enabled them to travel over great waters, rough waters like the Atlantic. So that made the Vikings explorers. And I always tell guests of Viking that when you go on the Viking ocean ship and you sit in the atrium bar, you should look under the counter, because under the counter there are wood planks made just like a Viking ship in the clinker built style. Good reason to go and have a drink. So then later in the Middle Ages, we have the Baltic cog that you see in the top center here. This was a very important workhorse of the Hanseatic League. It wasn't meant for big exploration, but it was meant to carry a lot of goods over some distance of water in the Baltic and the North Sea. And it was a very good vessel for that purpose, and enabled the Hanseatic League to dominate trade in the Baltic and the North Sea in the Middle Ages. But it wasn't until the Portuguese that we got a ship that was able to cross big oceans like the Atlantic with lots of cargo and lots of crew. That's the Portuguese caravel that you see on the top top right here. The caravel was a very important development in shipbuilding. It had a very strong hull, and that allowed it to have several masts. It could have up to 3 masts, and that allowed for quite considerable speed on the ship. And also the rigging changed with the Portuguese so that they could tack into the wind, which was very important in sailing large distances, often into the wind efficiently and faster than could be done in the past. So the Portuguese caravel was really the big ship that was used for exploration from the time of Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and the Portuguese explorers, and quite far into the 1500s, the Portuguese caravel. But also the Chinese had ships for exploration, and you see them in the lower section of this slide. And the biggest one on the right there is a sailing junk from around 1500. And what strikes you is that it's really huge. It's got not 3 sails, it's got 6, 7 masts with sails. And the ship is very, very large in itself, more than 400 feet long, had maybe a crew of 700 and multiple decks. And just for comparison, we put in this little La Pinta there that you can see maybe in the front of the ship, which was Christopher Columbus's ship when he crossed the Atlantic to discover the New World. So the Chinese were quite far ahead of us in shipbuilding at the time, just not to forget that. Let's talk a bit about some of the great maritime explorers that we maybe know about. Certainly Leif Erikson, the Viking. He was the first European to land in North America. That is quite well documented. He sailed from Greenland, where he had settled, and around the end of the 900s, and came to Newfoundland, North America, around year 1000, maybe year 1021. We have new dating of that arrival. Leif Erikson, the first one from Europe to land in North America. Next to him, we have Zheng He, a Chinese explorer who was sailing one of those huge junks we saw on the last slide. A very colorful character a eunuch who was taken into service of the Ming emperor, but then rose to the rank of admiral and had huge expeditions along the coast of China, all the way over to India, even reached as far as Africa. So the Chinese were also great explorers. To the right, Christopher Columbus, we all know him. In 1492, he sailed for Spain, crossed the Atlantic, and arrived in the Caribbean and opened the New World to exploration. Henry the Navigator on the lower left wasn't really a sailor himself, but he was a very important enabler for sailors and for maritime exploration, for the Portuguese particularly. He financed very many of the expeditions of the Portuguese. He also enabled ship development, navigational development, and so on. So a very important character in maritime exploration. Next to him, you have Vasco da Gama, who was one of the foremost Portuguese explorers. He opened the route sailing south along the coast of Africa and opened the sea route to India that way. And that gave the Portuguese really an advantage and a head start in getting to the markets in India and China. Then the last one on this slide is Juan Ponce de Leon, who actually was with Columbus on one of his expeditions, but later on also explored on his own, exploring particularly Florida, looking for the Fountain of Youth in Florida. Well, he opened up Florida for settlements, but ended up being the governor of Puerto Rico later in his career. Now, let's talk also about the motivation for this navigation and exploration. First of all, it was to find new trade routes. The overland trade routes in Europe, from Asia to Europe, were quite long, they were quite slow, and it was also a lot of bandits and robbers on the way. So they weren't really as safe and as, reliable anymore. So new trade routes on the sea was quite important as a motivator for the exploration and the discovery of the new world, to find a new way to bring lots of goods from Asia, lots of luxury goods from Asia over to Europe. There's also a bit of curiosity, a lot of curiosity actually, and we're all curious too, right? Viking travelers, we want to find different locations and explore different cultures and civilizations. And of course, the Europeans at the time, they were also curious about the lands that they had not discovered yet. What was beyond the Atlantic Ocean? This was a very important motivator for them as well. Land, wealth, and power, certainly very important for many of the countries to expand their control, their colonies, to get richer by finding new wealth and resources in new lands. Also, mythical locations, believe it or not. People were looking for the El Dorado, the city of gold, the Fountain of Youth, other things. And that, they never found those things, of course, but that kept them motivated. And so they kept on exploring and mapping and charting the lands that they explored. So that was very important too in opening up and getting us further on in the new world. And precious commodities, gold and silver, those were the big things that they were looking for to finance activities of the home country, be it a war, be it expansion in Europe. These precious commodities were truly something that they were looking to bring home to Europe. And finally, also greed. Greed was motivating a lot of explorers at the time. Certainly we see that when we see the Caribbean and the development of the plantations and the importation of all the slaves from Africa. This was a very very strongly motivated by greed, by getting rich and by exploiting both the islands and people to get this wealth for individuals. Now, the map on the right here is called the Birth Certificate of America. And you might wonder why. Well, you know, Christopher Columbus, he thought he had discovered the West Indies, the Indies, not a new continent. To his death, he thought he had come to India and to the Spice Islands. But one of his countrymen, Amerigo Vespucci, disputed that. He said, no, you haven't reached, the Far East. You've reached a new continent. And so he declared that this new land that had been discovered by Columbus and the explorers to follow him was actually a new continent. And he got the name America from his first name, Amerigo Vespucci. So it's called the Birth Certificate of America. And this was actually a gift by Angela Merkel to the United States on one of her visits. It's made by a German map maker. Continue. Yes, the trade routes were very important. You see this map showing you the trade routes from Asia overland over to Europe. First of all, it's quite a long way to go, and the camel caravans were quite slow, could not carry very much goods, and there was lots of robbers on the way. It was, it was a very precarious trip. And then you had the expansion of the Muslims, starting around 600, 620, when the Islam faith was founded. It expanded from Arabia north into Europe, and the big city of Constantinople fell in 1453, a big blow to the Christian European world, and also a blow to trade, because this was one of the trade hubs. So when this trade was cut off, going through Constantinople, this pushed the European nations to start looking for ways to get to the markets by sea. And you see the route that Vasco da Gama took, the one along the coast of Africa that dotted the green-blue route around the Cape of Good Hope over to India. And then you see the red lines are actually Christopher Columbus's 4 journeys over to the Caribbean and discovering the New World. Let's move on to look at the specific quest for Canada. Now, here is a timeline of Canadian history. I think it's quite useful to have that starting out for us. Now, the Inuits and the Indians had arrived in Canada and in North America already 10,000 BC and had settled there and lived there when the Europeans came. So this was quite an upsetting new development for all these tribes and indigenous peoples living there. So they had been there about 10,000 or so years before the Europeans arrived. Then the first Europeans came to North America with the Vikings, as I said, now dated to 1021 AD. The Vikings, headed by Leif Erikson, landed at the tip of Newfoundland and set up a settlement there that lasted for some years, the first European settlement in North America. Then the second one to arrive was Cabot, who actually arrived in 1497, sailing for England and discovered Newfoundland. And then the French came with their first explorer, Jacques Cartier, on his first voyage in 1534. And then following him about 75 years later was Champlain, who founded New France and also Quebec City in 1608. And then the Hudson Bay Company is founded in 1670, the big trading company that had monopoly on trade from a huge chunk of Canada from 1670 on for a couple of hundred years and more. 1754 to 63, a very important event, the French and Indian War, which actually resolved this long-standing dispute between France and Britain on who was to rule the New World. So the French gave up a lot of territory in this war. And finally, on our timeline, the foundation of Canada, which takes place in 1867, with the 4 provinces of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, forming the Federation of Canada. Now, we talked about the original population in North America being the Inuits and being the Indians, the Indian tribes settling a lot around the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River, the Inuits living further north in the land. Well, you must have been quite amazing for the English explorer Frobisher, to come to this island, Baffin Island, around 1576 and see these various igloos, basically, where these Inuits were living. Quite a different world from the England that he had left behind. So we'll talk a little bit more about Frobisher later, but just look at that image of this Inuit village. To the side there, sticking out from one of the igloos, you see a pole, and on that pole is actually a kayak. And this tells you that it obviously was very important to hang a wet kayak up in the air, not let it sit on the ground, or it would be frozen, stuck to the ice. All these things that they could learn from the Inuits and the Indians. So the Viking wave, as we call it, the first Europeans to reach North America, was Leif Erikson, now dated to 1021. And Leif Erikson was living in a settlement in Greenland. You see on this map here, Greenland is at the top of this map. There were 2 settlements in Greenland that had started around 980. And these settlements were from where the Vikings traveled further west along the coast, north, then over to Helluland or Baffin Island, then along the coast south, down via Labrador, and ending up in what they called Markland, which is the tip of Newfoundland. Probably a bit warmer and a bit greener than it is today, but that's where we know that the Vikings settled. A recreation of that settlement is shown in the photo in the center at Lance of Meadows in Newfoundland. There were some contacts with the local Indians, and the settlement didn't last very long, maybe 4 or 5, maximum 10 years perhaps, before they left and went back to Greenland and Iceland, and the settlement ended. And from the time of Columbus in the 15th to 19th century, there was a lot of exploration of Canada, as you can see from this map. You see the exploration of the eastern part happening a lot earlier than the exploration of the western part. We're not going to talk about all these expeditions, but it's interesting to note that most of it happens by ship. Traveling along the waterways to explore this new vast territory. And when the waterways ended, they could go up the rivers and travel and explore that way. It was very, very hard to travel overland in the Canadian wilderness, so that was not what they did at the time. So some of the explorers that are relevant to exploration of Canada are these guys here. First, John Cabot, who's actually an Italian. Giovanni Caboto is really his name. Many of the explorers, like Christopher Columbus, were Italian, and they went to service for other countries. John Cabot traveled or explored for England for Edward VII, the father of Henry VII, the father of Henry VIII, and he discovered Newfoundland, and that was how England very early on established settlements on Newfoundland and discovered fisheries up there. This was all as a result of John Cabot's arrival there very early in the 1500s. Then you have Martin Frobisher, who we'll talk about a little bit more in this talk, a British privateer and explorer who, in his his fancy dress here, traveled up to Baffin Island, as I showed in an earlier slide, and met the Inuits. But he also found something else he thought was gold, called fool's gold. But anyway, that's a story we'll get back to. Then we have Giovanni da Verrazzano, another Italian who was exploring for France and traveled from Florida up along the coast of present-day United States, all the way up to Maine and perhaps up to as far as Newfoundland, and left his mark. He was one of the first to discover present-day New York, and of course his name is still there on the Verrazzano Narrows Bridge between Brooklyn and Staten Island. Those of you from New York will recognize that name. He was the first one to come there, Verrazzano. Then we have Samuel de Champlain, another French explorer who was the one who established New France and Quebec City. And before him, we had Jacques Cartier, who had done several expeditions for France in the 1530s. The last one we'll pay some special attention to is Henry Hudson, who we've touched on a bit earlier. We'll talk a little bit more about his explorations as well for England. What were they really after? They were after a way to get from the Atlantic Ocean over to the Pacific by going via a northwest passage. This was really what drove them to go up as far north as they did, looking for this passage that would get them from the Atlantic Ocean over to the big markets in Asia by ship. And in those days, they thought that North America, or the whole of America, was quite a small sliver of land. They also thought the world was smaller, the globe was smaller, so this wouldn't be that far. But this Northwest Passage eluded them for years and years, as we shall see. But this was really the holy grail of the expedition to Canada. So instead, what did they find? Well, they found beaver pelts. They found commodities that they could use and that would be very attractive over in Europe. Traveling all these big waterways, Hudson Bay, up the rivers, meeting the Indians, seeing what they had of beaver pelts, that opened up this interest by the explorers to bring this beaver pelt over to Europe. And this was quite an important commodity eventually. Beaver pelts were quite interesting material because the beaver pelt has two sets of furs, a longer fur that really insulates against rain and snow, and then there's an inner fur that insulates against the cold. And there's an oil also that makes the pelt waterproof. So this was an ideal thing to wear. The Indians wore it, and Europeans started wearing it too. But then they brought it over to Europe, and it became quite popular. And in the process, they made not just beaver pelts, but beaver felts, which is a further processing of the fur into a material that you can use for example, hats. And these hats that you see here were becoming very, very popular in Europe and was in style for several hundred years, actually. So this became very quickly the big export from the Canadian territories over to Europe, and this lasted several hundred years. But getting around was quite tricky. You know, when they came as far as to Montreal, they couldn't navigate any further because of the rapids there. So they had to start using a different vessel to get around in the Canadian territory. And what they did was they took this thing that the Indians had, the birch bark canoe, which was a very, very good way of getting around on the rivers, very light and easily paddled. Canoe could be portaged, could also carry a lot of goods. So this became the tool of the trade. And as Samuel de Champlain said, this was the only way you can get around in the Canadian wilderness, using this birch bark canoe. The Indians had taken this birch and sewed it together and made it waterproof, and then built this beautiful vessel that became the workhorse. And the Europeans were quite surprised that they'd have to use this, because back in Europe they had gone on to different vessels. They weren't using canoes anymore and hadn't done that for thousands of years. But here in Canada, the birch bark canoe was the way to get around. And they also had to learn the ways of the Inuits, how to get around in the winter. They would have to use the traditional snowshoes that you see here on the right, different snowshoes for different snow conditions, some for forested areas, some for open fields. The Indians and the Inuits had developed this to perfection, and they had snowshoes that could get you around in any snow condition and in any geography, really. So that was the way to do it, learn from the locals. So they were setting up trading posts to get all this fur out to ships. And one of the bigger trading posts that was established was this one in Hudson's Bay. It was called York Factory. It's still there today as a museum. It was set up in 1684. And the Hudson's Bay Company got a monopoly from the English king to trade and to have monopoly on all trade from all the drainage into the drainage area into the Hudson Bay. And as you can see on the map to the right here, that was a huge area, a huge territory, maybe as big as a third of present-day Canada, was all controlled by the Hudson Bay Company and their fur trading. So so the York Factory became a very important trading post for hundreds of years. And you see a picture of it up in the upper left corner there. This was called Prince Rupert's Land, and Prince Rupert was actually the first governor of the Hudson Bay Company. He was a cousin of the king. He was Prince Rupert of the Rhine, so he was a German prince, and he was the first to be the governor of the Hudson Bay Company. The French also set up very important strategic outposts. You can see New France was kind of the territory you see here on the top of this map, mostly north of the St. Lawrence Seaway and around the Great Lakes. This was all New France, claimed by the French, and they set up various trading posts and also strategic defense installations along the way, along the river. From the map to the right, you see that the English colonies in the darker orange color, that was the new English colonies that were controlled by Britain. And then you had this gray area in between, and then you had New France on the top there. So there was constant struggles and wars between the English and the French about control of this territory and about control regarding control of the trade in this area. So let's look at some explorer profiles that have been very important in exploration of Canada. We'll start with Jacques Cartier, who's been called the founder of Canada. He was one of the first explorers to travel to Canada to discover the St. Lawrence waterways and the area around the St. Lawrence estuary, as you can see on the map. He made 3 voyages from 1534 for France, for King Francis I, and his mission was to discover lands with a great quantity of gold, and of course also to search for a passage over to the Pacific. He called this land Canada, which is really a word from an Indian language, which means village, Kanata. So this sort of stuck and became the name for this new land, Canada. So he's called the father of Canada. He was a very good map maker. None of these maps have survived, but he really charted a lot of this area. And as I said, made 3 voyages and got as far as Montreal, where I am today. And of course, in Montreal, you hit the rapids, the Lachine Rapids that prevent you from sailing any further. From that point on, you have to board a smaller vessel and take you further into the Great Lakes. When you go on the Actantis, you will come to Montreal and you'll go through the locks in the St. Lawrence Seaway. Those are the first locks to get you into the Great Lakes area. So that's as far as he got. Jacques Cartier. Frobisher, we talked about him briefly. He made 3 voyages, but he was a privateer, meaning he was kind of a person who was sailing on a license from the king or queen. In this case, he was sailing on a license from Queen Elizabeth I of England. And he sailed up to Baffin Island and discovered that area. And his mission was really to find the Northwest Passage. But he gave up that quickly when he saw the ice that blocked his way and started looking for gold. And he found something that's called fool's gold. It really looks like gold, but it isn't. So this fool's gold is, well, he brought it back to England and convinced everybody this was gold and got money for another expedition and went back and mined even more of this stuff. So it was quite a fun story about Frobisher. He also brought back a couple of locals, Inuits. You see them on the images on the right here, a man and a woman. He brought them back to England, and there's even a baby there in the woman's hat or bag. You see there was a baby, and this was a great spectacle, coming to England with these Inuits. Nobody had seen any people looking like that before, so this was a great excitement for the English to see people from these new lands. So Queen Elizabeth I financed another voyage for him to go back and explore more. So that's Frobisher. Then we have Samuel de Champlain, who was very, very, very extensive in exploring Canada and establishing what was called New France, which is a huge area of land which stretches along the St. Lawrence River into the Great Lakes, covering most of the Great Lakes area and down the Mississippi River, and eventually creating this huge area, New France, in the new colonies. I mean, he was one of the first explorers to start that exploration. He had 5 voyages from 1603 and established, the French colony of New France and also Quebec City. He also explored a lot, Lake Champlain, wrote a lot of books. He wrote, journals from his travels. That was very important. The only journals we really have from exploration at that time. So that was very useful, Champlain's journals and travel logs. He was later asked to go back and govern New France for the king. And he actually had maybe 20, 30 trips across the Atlantic back to France from the colonies. So he was quite an important traveler and governor of the new territory of New France. Then we have Henry Hudson. We don't really know much about him from early days, but he did some work for the Muscovy Company, trying to find the Northeast Passage, sailing up along Norway, trying to find a passage over by Russia. That didn't work. Then later on, he was on an expedition by the Dutch East India Company to try to find some land down in the Americas. He landed around present-day New York and sailed up the Hudson River, and giving that river its name, the Hudson River, from Henry Hudson. And of course, this led to the establishment of the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, which is present-day Lower Manhattan. So that was Henry Hudson's expedition for the Dutch. But later on, he was hired by the English to try and find the Northwest Passage. So around 1610, 11, he sails up to what is to become Hudson Bay and discovers Hudson Bay, the Hudson Strait, all in an effort to find a way across over to the Pacific. Unfortunately, there was a mutiny on his ship in 1611, and he was set adrift in a small boat with his son. So obviously died up there. That was his fate, Henry Hudson. So, by the early 1600s, there were three really big countries that had claims in North America. The French certainly had a huge claim. New France, you see that in the light blue color, covering all of the St. Lawrence River basin, the Great Lakes, and all the way down to the Mississippi. Then you had England, who had the colonies, and of course Newfoundland and Nova Scotia in the purple, and also the Hudson Bay area. That was a holding of the British. And then of course Spain, which had most of the Central American mainland, Mexico, also a huge chunk of present-day United States, and Florida. That was the situation after the explorers and opening up of Canada in the early 1700s. So let's look a little bit more at the legacy of the exploration for Canada. The Northwest Passage remained very elusive. The quest was never fulfilled. There was a long search. Everybody had that as their prime goal and ended up discovering other things. And one of the last big efforts by the English was the Franklin expedition led by Sir John Franklin in 1845. He set sail with two ships, the Erebus and the Terror, and sailed, up into the Canadian Arctic and got lost. And this expedition was never heard from again. And it set off a big rescue effort from the English. There were huge rewards for anybody who could find this expedition or rescue them, or at least indicate what had gone wrong. But that remained a big, big mystery what had happened to this expedition once it got into the Canadian Arctic, the Franklin expedition. So eventually they assumed that they had succumbed to the environment, and a painting like you see in the lower left corner here is in quite a bad taste. You see the ship broken apart and the polar bears feasting on the sailors, found to be in very bad taste by the English. So it wasn't really until the Norwegian explorer Amundsen, Roald Amundsen, who made the passage through the Northwest Passage, and he did it in a couple of years between 1903 and 1906. He went in and wintered in the Canadian Arctic and lived with the Inuits there and learned from the Inuits, learned a lot about where the passage may be when it opened up, when the ice melted, and eventually sailed through to the Pacific as the first person to do that. But even then, it was a very difficult and dangerous passage, and it wasn't until the 1940s that other ships went through in one season and so on. Present day, it's much more possible to sail through because the ice has receded. There's global warming, so there's much less ice there in the summer, and it may become or perhaps has become already a shipping route for commercial ships. So we mentioned that Canada was established in 1867 as a dominion, as running it with its parliament, running its own affairs under the British Commonwealth, of course. But after 1867, a lot of treaties were made with the Aboriginal peoples, the First Nations, as they're called in Canada. These are called the numbered treaties, and they're quite controversial. They were made in the rush, first to enable the Canadian Pacific Railroad to be established across the provinces, but then later, because of exploration of minerals, gold, the gold rush in 1899, for example, was a huge driver to make these treaties with the Indians. They were quite one-sided. They were only in the English language. It's also disputed whether oral promises were made that were never fulfilled. Basically, the Indians would give up the land to the English crown in return for some services. These are still law in Canada today, but are still quite controversial to this day, these numbered treaties. So Canada today has ended up being a federation of 10 provinces. The smallest one is Prince Edward Island out in the St. Lawrence. The latest one to join was Newfoundland and Labrador, which joined in 1849. In addition to those 10 provinces, there's 3 territories in Canada. Territories have less autonomy. They are given powers from the federal government, whereas the provinces themselves have powers from the Constitution of Canada. The most recent territory is Nunavut. You see in the light blue color here on this map. It was established in 1899, and on the right side you see this new legislative building in Iqaluit, in Nunavut. And this is actually shaped like an igloo. You can probably see that the building architecture is like an igloo, a rounded, vaulted ceiling. So that's the legislative building, Iqaluit. Okay, we're coming soon to the end of the talk today. I just want to touch on the Canadian diversity and see how different Canada is when it comes to its heritage. Most Canadians claim an English, Scottish, or Irish heritage. French heritage is also claimed by about 14% of the people, and the First Nations are a bit less than 5%, between 4 and 5% of the peoples in Canada are claimed to be of First Nations origin. And this map is quite interesting because it tells you how people see themselves in the census when they're asked, what ethno-linguistic heritage they have. They will answer, and the census records that. And this red color you see to the right, they define themselves as Canadian. So that's now become a new ethno-linguistic heritage covering most of Quebec and Ontario. And then you have some other, well, the brown part is, First Nations, and the northern part there is the Inuit, and then there are some small spots of Italians, and French seems to be very few places. That's the blue color. But I guess most of the French go into this red category and see themselves as Canadian rather than of French heritage. Hey, and here is a legacy from the exploration. The Hudson's Bay Company still exists today. Doesn't have a monopoly like it did back in 1670. But it still operates, and it's an iconic company, department store in Canada. And you can visit the Hudson's Bay Company and its stores in Montreal, Toronto, and most of the bigger cities in Canada. And it all comes back to this guy here, the North American beaver, who really was the alternative to gold and to the Northwest Passage. He was the one who gave the commodity that made everyone exploring Canada rich by trading fur to Europe, the Canadian beaver. Its population 15 million perhaps today in Canada. So that kind of brings us to the end of my talk today. We have talked about the pre-Canadian exploration, the motivations, new trade routes, commodities and fame. We have talked about the quest for the Northwest Passage as a new route to the Far East. We also saw that fur trading became the big thing, the big trade, the big commodity that fueled the existence of the settlers in the new territories. And also we saw a bit today, Canada, a rich blend of French, English, and Inuit First Nation heritage. So that brings me to the end of the talk, and as promised, we do have some time for questions. There might be some questions that you have posted on the Viking.TV site. So I'll give the word back to Scott to read us some of those questions. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Yes, we've got plenty of questions for you today, Knut. And our first one comes from Mariette, who's in Brunswick in the United States. She says, my dad used to say that his side of the family are descendants of the Viking berserks who settled in Canada. Could this actually be true?
Well, that's an interesting claim. We know that Vikings came here for sure. Now the Viking berserkers, they were kind of these wild fighting Vikings that had probably taken some mushroom or something psychedelic to enhance their fighting capabilities. Now, we know that the Vikings did settle in Newfoundland, and we also know from finds there that they did travel further than that, because there's some butternut that has been found in the Viking settlement that must come from another area south maybe Nova Scotia or sort of New Brunswick or so. And we don't really know much about the settlement. There is a saga about this settlement. The Greenland saga tells us about this, and it tells us about some of the people who settled here, but also tells us that it ends, that they go back to Greenland. And if some of them actually, stayed on and mixed with the First Nations or moved on, we don't know. There's no archaeological or historic proof of that. So I think you can still claim and live in the hope that this is your origin, but we don't have any historic proof that this is the case today.
Thank you. And our next question for you comes from Evelyn, who is in Ocean Grove. She asks, do we know why the reasons that the Viking settlements didn't survive to establish a community in the longer term?
There is speculation. They were small settlements. They were not very large amounts of people. It's hard to say. Maybe they were 100. Maybe more. And we know for sure that they had encounters with the Indian populations. The Vikings called them skræling. They seem to be have a pretty they were fighting with them. They weren't really that friendly, at least from what we know. So we believe that these First Nations Indian populations probably were a threat to the Vikings, and that could have been a reason why they eventually left, and maybe many of them were also killed in battles with the Indians. So it's all speculation. We know they had contact. We know they went back. We can speculate as to the reasons why it happened.
Thank you. And our next question comes from Esther, who is in Portland. Her question is quite a simple one. It's where does the name Canada actually come from?
Yes, it was a name that Jacques Cartier gave to this territory because he had met Indians who called it Kanata, and these were Indian from the Indian language. So this was a name that the Indians themselves had given to this land. So Cartier kept that name, and it's kind of stuck, I guess. So this territory was then eventually called Kanata or Canada today. So it's an Indian name that means village.
Perfect, thank you. And our next question for you comes from Eric, who is in Austin. And he asks, when did the government of Canada adopt the maple leaf as the national flag?
That was between the First and the Second World War, I think. It was quite late. Canada, they were under sort of stronger British control until the 1930s. That's when Canada sort of got complete autonomy, and in that process also the flag came, because before that they had the Union Jack as a part of the flag. So it wasn't that time. I can't really give you exactly the year. It shouldn't be hard to find, but it was in the process of Canada becoming autonomous from England, the United Kingdom.
There we are then. Thank you very much. And our next question comes from America, who is in Park Ridge. Of course, the presentation did touch on this, but her question is, what are the main resources in Canada that the early European explorers wanted?
Well, the first thing they struck was a lot of fisheries. Cabot came to Newfoundland and they saw that there were a lot of fisheries up in these waters, off the coast of Newfoundland and off the coast of Nova Scotia. So the fish was a real big and very valuable commodity that came over from Canada to Europe. And then as they went further inland, it was really the beaver pelts and the fur. The fur trade really financed the settlements and the activities of Canada. Of course, today we know that Canada is very rich in a multitude of minerals, gold, zinc, silver, oil, so on. But for the early settlers, it was really fur and fisheries, I would say. And then perhaps after that, lumber.
Thank you. And our next question for you comes from James, who is in the United States. He asks, how come the Chinese didn't settle Canada before the Europeans? What stopped the Chinese from crossing the Pacific?
Good question. If you study the Chinese expeditions, these big treasure expeditions, as they're called, they happened around between 1400 and 1500. And they were huge expeditions with many, many ships that sailed south along the coast and into the Indian Ocean and so on. They were primarily diplomatic missions. They did not colonize and settle and conquer lands, the Chinese. So that was kind of one of the reasons probably why they didn't end up settling any of those lands that they came to. Also, around 1500, the emperor banned exploration. So from that point on, Chinese were not allowed to have ships with more than 2 masts, I think. And so exploration was banned by the emperor. So from that point on, there wasn't any more Chinese expeditions. China became looking inward. Also, crossing the Pacific was not easy. It's a big ocean, and you have to go with the trade wind. So that's a big challenge to go from that side over to North America. That's my guess.
There we are then. And our next question for you comes from John, who is also in the United States. He asks, what mythical locations did the early explorers think could be in the area that we now know as Canada?
Yes, that's a good question. Well, they were looking for mythical locations like El Dorado, and also mythical locations like mountains of silver. Now, they found a lot of silver and gold in Central and South America, but there's no reason why those mythical locations couldn't be up in Canada. But Canadian exploration came later in the age of exploration. So by then, maybe this mythical location hope had vanished, and people were looking for more practical things like the Northwest Passage by the time they started exploring Canada. So that's, I think, is my answer. The mythical locations could have been in Canada too, not just Central or South America.
There we are then. And our next question for you comes from Ruth, who is in Bergen. She asks, how did the Inuits arrive in Canada? Was there a land bridge 10,000 BC?
Oh, thank you for asking that question. I missed that when I talked about the Inuits. Yes, there was a land bridge, and that's how the whole original native population, First Nations of North America, and even as far down as South America, they came over that land bridge between present-day Russia over to Alaska. There was a land bridge, 10,000 or so years ago. And so while some of the Indians then moved south, there were some openings in the glaciers, valleys where they could travel to come south. And then some of the population went east and became the Inuits that we see up in the north, in the Arctic Canada today.
Thank you. And our next question for you comes from Marion, who is in Exeter here in the UK. And she asks, how many people worked at the York factory when it was built?
That's a good question. I don't think I have the exact number for you, but it was certainly the biggest fort or trading place. And the thing about the York factory is that it is in Hudson Bay. So in the summer, you can sail the ship all the way in to Hudson Bay and bring, it was a good point to load the ships for shipping back to Canada. How many people work there? Maybe a couple of hundred, maybe 500 or more, but a lot of people sort of came and went because they were trappers and hunters, and they would go into the wilderness, use their canoes up the rivers, and they would bring back the fur, and then they would sell them at the York factory, and then maybe stay there for a while and then go on a different expedition. So I'm sure we can find a number, but it must have been several hundreds, I think.
Thank you very much. And we've got a comment here from one of our regular viewers, Mika, who is in Montclair in the United States. And she said she was so excited to see yourself talking about Atlantic Canada because she's got a cruise booked with Viking on one of our upcoming ships, the Viking Saturn. And she's departing from New York, going up to Iceland, Greenland, and of course Canada as well. And she's saying she can't wait, and this presentation has definitely excited her to go up the Canadian coast. But our next question for you comes from Gary, who is in the United States. He says, you refer to the York factory as a factory, but the word factory didn't mean what it does today. Could you please explain this further?
Yes, the word factory, that's a good point actually, because we think of factory today as a place of production, but factory was the word used for a trading post way back in the time of exploration. So there are many other factories, even in French, they use the same word. And so these hubs or centers, let's say, where this exchange of trade and shipping point, let's say, they were called factories. And that was the name they used. And it doesn't mean that there was any kind of mechanical production or like we understand today. This was the word used for the trading post, a factory. So it's a bit confusing, but that's what the word meant back in those days.
Thank you very much. And our next question comes from William, who is in Los Angeles in the United States. He first of all says, thank you for a very interesting presentation. You've made it very easy to understand Canadian history. But his question is, what is the best time of year to travel to Canada, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, there's all kinds of seasons in Canada. Certainly, if you want to travel on the Great Lakes, the season is, starting, I guess, May to about October. The locks do not operate all through the year, so that's one restriction. The fall colors are beautiful in the fall, so that's a season definitely to come up to Canada and enjoy that. Winter tourism is also very big, both skiing and seeing northern lights and exploring Arctic living during the winter. There's things to do all year round. Of course, the summers are when the warm weather is here between May and October. So that's a great time to go, and the weather in Canada becomes quite warm in the summer. It's quite warm, and yeah, especially around Montreal, Toronto, Great Lakes area, it's quite warm in the summer.
Perfect. And our next question for you comes from David, who is in Orlando in the US. He asks, did Canada have any slave trade in its history at all?
There was slaves in Canada too, but very early on the slave was abolished. We were kind of a part of the English process. So when England abolished slavery, that was also abolished in Canada, and Canada became a haven for slaves who escaped. Yes, I think if you go back far enough, we do have slaves here. We didn't have the big plantations that where the slaves were used, primarily tobacco and sugar and cotton and so on. Those big plantations we don't see in Canada, but we did have a part of that dark history, I guess, but very early on abolished slavery and became a haven for freed slaves.
Thank you very much. And we do have one last question for you, but that is all the time we have for questions this evening. But our last question for you comes from Jean, who is in New York City. And she asks, what is the painting behind you and who painted it?
Oh, thank you for that. That's a very lovely painting, one of our favorites. It's by a Montreal artist called Yehuda Shaki, who's still alive in his late 70s or 80, and he's a very prolific painter, and he's got this very colorful palette. He's of Israeli Greek origin, but lives and teaches here in Canada and has his main place of work here in Montreal. His images are often of scenes from the Middle East. So I think the one you see behind me is in the Middle East. I remember talking to him, and he indicated that it would be somewhere, maybe in Lebanon, Golan, something like that. So you see the cedar trees and the colorful hills around. Makes you maybe think of that area. So you should look him up, Shaki, C-H-A-K-I.
Perfect. And that's all the questions we have time for today.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for logging in to Viking.TV. I wish all of you happy travels. Enjoy Canada, and hope to see you on board a Viking ship sooner or later. Thank you very much.